Daniel hadn't stepped into the Carter household in years. Life had carried him far from the quiet neighborhood where he and his best friend Emily had once grown up. He had built a career, endured heartbreak, and carried responsibilities that made his shoulders heavy. But when Emily invited him back after so long, he agreed, thinking it would just be an ordinary visit. A chance to catch up and relive old times. The moment he walked through the familiar front door, a wave of memories swept over him. The smell of fresh baked bread, the warmth of the living room, and the sound of the wooden floor creaking under his steps, it all felt like stepping back in time. But there was one thing that had changed. Mrs. Carter. Emily's mother stood before him, looking older yet carrying the same grace she always had. Her hair was now streaked with silver, and her face showed lines of wisdom, but her eyes still held that soft, knowing light Daniel remembered from his youth. They exchanged polite greetings, and Daniel sat on the couch trying to relax. He expected casual small talk questions about work, about where life had taken him, maybe even a few playful jokes about how much he had aged. Instead, Mrs. Carter studied him quietly, her expression thoughtful. Then, without warning, she leaned forward slightly, her voice calm but heavy with meaning. "Daniel," she said, "are you still beautiful?" The words stopped him cold. He blinked, unsure if he had heard her correctly. The room, filled moments ago with the comfort of nostalgia, suddenly felt different, sharper, heavier, as if every detail around him had frozen to make room for that one question. Daniel forced a small laugh, trying to brush it off. "That's a strange thing to ask," he said lightly, though inside he felt unsettled. Why would she say something like that? Why would she look at him with such seriousness, as if the question held more weight than the simple words suggested? Her gaze didn't shift. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't teasing. She seemed to be searching him, almost as if she wanted to see beyond his face, beyond his surface, into something deeper. Daniel shifted uncomfortably, leaning back on the couch. "I'm not sure I ever was," he said, half joking. But even he could hear the uncertainty in his voice. Mrs. Carter only tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. She gave no answer, no explanation, just silence that stretched long enough for Daniel to feel it pressing against him. He wanted to ask her what she meant, but Emily entered the room at that moment, cheerful and unaware of the strange tension that had filled the air. "Daniel, I can't believe you're here after all these years," Emily said, hugging him. Daniel forced a smile, grateful for the distraction. They began catching up, talking about old friends, about how much had changed, and about how life seemed to move faster than they ever imagined. But even as Emily's laughter filled the room, Daniel couldn't shake the weight of Mrs. Carter's question. "Are you still beautiful?" It wasn't about appearance. He could tell that from the way she asked it. Her tone carried something deeper, almost like a memory tied to who he once was. Not what he looked like now. The evening went on, conversations circling between past and present. But Daniel's mind stayed tangled in those 4 words. Mrs. Carter barely spoke after that, only offering polite smiles and listening quietly. Every now and then, Daniel caught her eyes on him, not in judgment, but in a way that made him feel both seen and exposed. When it was time to leave, Emily hugged him goodbye, promising to meet again soon. Mrs. Carter stood by the door, her expression calm, her voice soft. "It was good to see you, Daniel." He nodded, offering a polite smile, but deep down, he felt as though their short exchange had left something unfinished. He walked out into the cool night air, his mind spinning, driving home. The streets blurred past him, but his thoughts stayed stuck in that living room. He couldn't understand why the question mattered so much, yet it did. He replayed her voice in his head over and over, hearing the weight behind it. It wasn't casual, it wasn't careless, it was intentional. What did she see in him that made her ask that? What did she mean by still beautiful? The night felt long as Daniel wrestled with questions he didn't want to admit mattered to him. For years he had carried the weight of disappointments, the quiet heartbreaks, the lost chances. He had buried parts of himself he thought were gone forever. But now, a single question from his best friend's mother had stirred something he wasn't ready to face. And though he told himself to let it go, deep inside, he knew he wouldn't. That night, Daniel lay in bed staring at the ceiling, unable to rest. He had come home exhausted, but his mind refused to quiet down. The question from Mrs. Carter echoed inside him, sharp and insistent. "Are you still beautiful?" He had tried to laugh it off at first, but alone in the dark, there was no avoiding it. Those words carried something that wouldn't let him go. He turned to the side, pressing his head into the pillow. But instead of sleep, memories flooded in. He saw himself years ago, a boy with messy hair and too much energy, running through the Carter household as though it were his second home. He remembered afternoons spent in Emily's room, working on school projects or listening to music, and the times Mrs. Carter would bring them snacks, always smiling, always gentle. She wasn't just Emily's mother. She was part of the world Daniel had grown up in, a figure of grace and warmth that quietly shaped the way he saw kindness. Back then, Mrs. Carter often spoke to him in ways others didn't. Adults usually dismissed kids his age, but not her. She looked him in the eye when he talked, as if his thoughts mattered. Once, when he was about 17, she had paused in the kitchen and said, "Daniel, you carry a light in your eyes. Don't ever lose it." At the time, he had smiled awkwardly, unsure what she meant. But now, lying in the quiet of his apartment, those words returned with force. Maybe that was what she had meant by beautiful. Not his face, not the way he looked, but something inside. A spirit, a spark, a hope. And maybe she had seen that spark fading. Daniel sat up in bed, running his hands over his tired face. He couldn't deny it, life had changed him. He wasn't the boy who believed anything was possible. He had taken risks, chased dreams, and lost more often than he'd won. There had been love once, a love he thought would last, but it had ended in silence, leaving behind a scar he still carried. Work had given him stability, but not joy. His laughter wasn't as easy anymore. His smiles didn't reach his eyes the way they once had. And maybe Mrs. Carter had noticed. Maybe she was the first person in years to look at him closely enough to see what he had lost. The more he thought about it, the more restless he became. He got out of bed and poured himself a glass of water, standing by the window as the city lights blinked outside. He thought about the way Mrs. Carter had looked at him, serious, almost searching, as if she wasn't asking about beauty, but about whether he still recognized himself. He remembered how, when he was younger, he used to dream endlessly. He wanted to travel, to write, to live a life full of meaning. And for a while, he did chase those dreams. But time, responsibility, and heartbreak had worn him down. Somewhere along the line, he had stopped believing he was special. He had stopped seeing himself the way others once did. It struck him then that maybe the question wasn't meant to unsettle him, but to remind him. Maybe Mrs. Carter wanted him to think, to remember, to reflect on the person he had once been. Daniel closed his eyes and let the memories continue. He saw Mrs. Carter years ago, standing in the garden while he and Emily played. She was radiant in the sunlight, her laughter carrying through the air. There was always something elegant about her, something that made her presence comforting. She wasn't just Emily's mom. She was someone who believed in beauty, not just outward beauty, but the beauty of spirit, of hope, of kindness. When she had said those words earlier, "Are you still beautiful?" it had felt like a test, a reminder, a quiet challenge. Was the boy with light in his eyes still alive somewhere within him? Or had the world taken him away completely? The thought weighed heavily on him. He wanted to say yes, to believe he was still beautiful in that way. But deep down, he wasn't sure. Years of carrying disappointment had dimmed something inside him. And the mirror often reflected not just his face, but the tiredness behind his eyes. But then another memory surfaced. He recalled a time when he had been at his lowest after losing his first big job. He had stopped by the Carter house unexpectedly, feeling defeated. Mrs. Carter had sat with him at the kitchen table, pouring tea as if he were her own son. She didn't lecture him or tell him to be strong. Instead, she said, "You're allowed to fall, Daniel. But don't let the fall convince you that you can't rise again. There's still so much beauty in you." It's that moment, simple as it was, had stayed with him for years, though he had buried it under layers of time. Now it came rushing back, making his chest tighten. She had seen something in him long ago, something he no longer saw in himself. As the night stretched on, Daniel sat in silence, torn between who he was and who he used to be. He realized that Mrs. Carter's question wasn't just about the past. It was about the present, about the man standing in her living room after all those years. She had looked at him and wondered if the spark was still there. Daniel couldn't keep the question out of his mind. Days passed, but the memory of that evening clung to him like a shadow. He went through work, met deadlines, answered calls, and smiled at people when necessary. But beneath the surface, he was restless. It wasn't just curiosity. It was the way Mrs. Carter had looked at him when she asked. There had been no teasing in her voice, no casual remark. It was as if she had been holding that question inside for years, waiting for the moment he returned. Finally, Daniel decided he couldn't stay away. He told himself it was to see Emily again, maybe share another evening of catching up. But deep down, he knew it was more than that. He wanted answers. He wanted to know what Mrs. Carter had meant. Why those words carried so much weight. The following Saturday, he drove back to the Carter house. Emily was out running errands, but Mrs. Carter greeted him at the door with her warm, gentle smile. "Daniel," she said softly, as though she had expected him. "Come in." The house felt the same as before, calm, familiar, filled with traces of the past. She poured him tea, and they sat at the dining table. For a while, they spoke about simple things, the weather, how fast the year was moving, small updates about Emily's job. But beneath their polite conversation was a silence waiting to be broken. Daniel felt it pressing between them, unspoken but undeniable. Finally, he set his cup down. His voice was steady, though his heart raced. "Why did you ask me that?" Mrs. Carter looked at him, her eyes gentle but serious. She didn't rush to answer. She seemed to search for the right words, as if she wanted to be careful not to hurt him. At last, she sighed and leaned back slightly. "Because I remember you differently, Daniel," she said. "I remember a young man who walked into this house full of dreams, full of energy, full of hope. You were radiant in your own way. You laughed with your whole soul. And when I saw you again after so many years, I could see that something had changed. Life has taken something from you. So I asked if you were still beautiful, not to embarrass you, but to know if you still see yourself the way I once saw you." Daniel sat quietly, the weight of her words sinking in. He had expected something lighter, maybe even a half-joke. But her honesty was sharper than he imagined. She wasn't talking about his looks. She was talking about his spirit, about something deeper that he had been trying to hide even from himself. He opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. What could he say? That she was right. That the years had chipped away at the fire he once carried. That sometimes, when he looked in the mirror, he barely recognized the man staring back. Instead, he lowered his eyes to the table. Silence stretched between them, not uncomfortable, but heavy with truth. Mrs. Carter continued, her voice softer now. "Beauty isn't just what we see in the mirror. It's the way you live, the way you carry yourself, the way you believe in something greater than the moment. When you were young, you shined with that, and I think you still can. But I also see the tiredness in you. I see the weight." Her words struck him like a quiet confession, as if she had noticed what no one else ever did. He felt his chest tighten, motions rising he hadn't expected to feel. "I don't know if I am still that person," he admitted finally, his voice low. "I've lost so much over the years. Things didn't turn out the way I thought they would. Sometimes I feel like I left the best parts of me in the past." Mrs. Carter's expression softened further. She reached across the table, not touching his hand, but resting her palm near it, close enough to feel the warmth. "Then maybe it's not about being the same person you were. Maybe it's about finding the beauty in who you've become. Even with the struggles, even with the losses. That light doesn't disappear, only hides when we stop believing in it." Daniel swallowed hard, her words stirring something inside him he didn't know how to name. For so long he had carried the weight of disappointment alone, convinced no one saw it. But here she was, seeing straight through him with compassion instead of judgment. He wanted to thank her, to tell her how much her words meant, but the moment felt too fragile to break with clumsy speech. Instead, he sat there in silence, heart heavy yet strangely lighter than before. Outside, the afternoon sun streamed through the curtains, casting a warm glow across the room. It made the moment feel suspended, as if time itself had slowed just for them. Daniel felt as though they were speaking about more than just him. More than just beauty, they were speaking about life itself. About the quiet battles everyone carries but rarely admits. When Emily returned later, the spell broke. She walked in cheerfully, setting bags on the counter, unaware of the conversation that had filled the room in her absence. She greeted Daniel warmly, laughing about how long it had been since they all sat together. Daniel smiled, but his thoughts were still tangled in Mrs. Carter's words. As the evening wound down, he found himself glancing at Mrs. Carter often, wondering if she knew what her honesty had stirred in him. She didn't mention the question again, nor did he. But when he left, he carried her words with him, etched deeply into his heart. That night, lying in bed once more, Daniel realized he hadn't felt so seen in years. Her voice replayed in his mind. Beauty isn't just what we see in the mirror. It's how you live, how you believe. He turned onto his side, staring into the darkness. For the first time in a long while, he felt a flicker of something he thought he had lost. Not hope exactly, not yet, but something close to it, and in that quiet, he wondered whether what he felt was only gratitude for her wisdom, or whether it was something more, something deeper that neither of them had dared to name. The following week, Daniel returned once more. He told himself it was to see Emily, but when he parked his car outside the Carter home, his heart knew the truth. He wanted to see Mrs. Carter again. Their last conversation had unsettled him, yet it had also awakened something inside that refused to fade. The question, the way she looked at him, the honesty in her words, it lingered every day, whispering to him when he was alone. Emily wasn't home when he arrived. Just as before, Mrs. Carter opened the door, surprised but not unkind. "Daniel," she said, her voice gentle. "I didn't expect you today," smiled faintly. "I was nearby. Thought I'd stop by." She invited him in, and they sat on the porch this time, where the late afternoon sun painted the sky in warm colors. The garden stretched before them, quiet and peaceful. For a while, neither spoke. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that carried weight, filled with unspoken thoughts. Finally, Daniel broke it. "I've been thinking about what you said." Mrs. Carter looked at him, her eyes steady. "About beauty." He nodded. "About all of it. About how I used to be. About how I see myself now. I realized maybe I stopped believing in the things that once gave me light. Somewhere along the way, I let go of the person I used to be. And maybe that's why your question stayed with me. Because I didn't know how to answer it." Her expression softened, a mixture of sadness and warmth. "It wasn't meant to wound you, Daniel. It was meant to remind you. Life takes from us, but it also gives. You're not the boy who sat in my kitchen years ago. You're a man now. You've lived, you've been hurt, you've grown. That doesn't make you less beautiful. It just makes your beauty different." Daniel swallowed hard, her words settling deep in him. He felt a pull, something he had been fighting to ignore, rising closer to the surface. "When you asked me that question," he said quietly, "it felt like you saw something I couldn't. It made me wonder if the person I used to be still exists, or if he's gone forever." Mrs. Carter turned her gaze to the horizon, where the sun was sinking low. Her voice was calm but carried a tremor, as if she, too, was revealing something she had kept hidden. "He's not gone, Daniel. He's waiting. Sometimes we bury parts of ourselves because we're afraid to feel again. But beauty isn't only about youth or dreams. It's about whether your heart can still open, whether you can still love without fear." The words struck him deeper than he expected. He wanted to respond, but his throat tightened. He looked at her, really looked at her, and saw more than Emily's mother. He saw a woman who had carried her own weight, earned years of silence and sacrifice. yet still spoke of beauty as if it were alive in everyone. The moment stretched between them, fragile and powerful. Daniel's chest tightened with emotions he didn't want to name. Gratitude, admiration, longing, everything tangled together. He hadn't felt this way in years. And it scared him as much as it moved him. "Then maybe I am still beautiful," he whispered at last. Almost to himself, Mrs. Carter turned back to him, her eyes glistening with something unspoken. She didn't answer right away, and the silence itself felt like a confession. Finally, she smiled softly, a smile filled with tenderness. "Yes, Daniel, you are." They sat together as the last of the light faded, neither saying more. Words weren't needed. The air between them carried all the weight, all the meaning that language could not. For Daniel, it was a moment of rediscovery, a reminder that even after years of silence and loss, his heart could still feel. When Emily returned later, cheerful and unaware, the moment quietly dissolved. Daniel greeted her, talked, and laughed, but inside he carried the memory of the porch, the sunset, and Mrs. Carter's voice. Asterisk.